And now I'm going to turn this over to all of you. So we have a runner with a mic if you have questions, and we have Joan who will moderate.
Yeah, what did you think? Did you all know about these camps that were here in New Mexico? Any? Yes.
Somebody told me that Lordsburg had been the location of a camp in New Mexico, but I found no indication, no indicia, no marker. Right here?
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Is there now one? This was back in 2006 when I first
Yes.
returned to New Mexico.
Yes, there's a marker there, and there's one in the whole side of the camp in Santa Fe is also no longer, but there is a plaque there that commemorates it.
And over here? More?
Any other comments or questions?
Somebody else have a comment?
I guess I have another question then.
Okay, all right, go ahead.
So Nikki, I used to live in the Seattle area. Where is she?
Right here.
Yeah,
Oh.
where I went to law school. And I went back for Thanksgiving to visit my father and his children, and I hadn't been back in a while, and I went into the International District in Seattle, and I was in a store by chance, and all of a sudden, I kind of stumbled over part of a living history project in that store. Do you know what I'm referring to?
The
So right,
story, what you know?
I don't remember the name of the store.
the Japanese textile store in Jackson.
The Japanese textiles.
It was sort of in front of the Hotel Panama, the Panama Hotel. Do you know? Yes?
And they had that little cafe, the little Japanese cafe in there.
They had boxes to commemorate how people had packed their things up, suitcases from the era, little photographs, small narratives. You could sit and watch a video clip. It was fascinating. And I was so pleased to see that. And I'm wondering, were you part of that project?
Well, you know, I haven't, I've been teaching in Florida, at Florida State, and then I came here in 2007. And although I've gone back and forth, I'm really a New Mexican. Escaping rain and overcast.
Well, welcome. This is really wonderful.
But Uwajimaya, and this is the owner of Uwajimaya, is he's second generation Japanese American. His mother and father were immigrants, were Issei. They had a little mom and pop grocery store, but they sent all their kids to college. They had a big family, and a lot of them got MBAs, and they started this business. Uwajimaya is the largest Japanese American or Asian American department store. It takes up the whole block in Seattle in the International District. And so that's in one generation that has happened.
I recommend that anyone who wants to take a trip to Washington State.
So if anybody knows the name of that store.
To that, yeah, go to that area. And then there's a novel on the corner of Bitter and Sweet, which is
Oh yeah, that's
yes.
a wonderful
song.
song.
That same
On the
name.
corner of Bitter and Sweet.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you have any mixed feelings about that check from the government?
It wasn't big enough.
Well, I owe my PhD to it. And so I went to graduate school. I said, you know, when I was 64, that's to Florida State in 2002. And everybody was 40 years younger than I was. And I just had the greatest time, but I've never been to so many baby showers in my life. And that's what brought me here, because then I received a fellowship at the Santa Fe Art Institute. And although I knew as a child that my dad had been in Santa Fe, I didn't know very much about it. I grew up in Chicago because my mother refused to return to the West Coast after the war, and my mother was the only Japanese person I knew growing up. So it wasn't until I was 16 years old and returned to the Pacific Northwest that, you know, I mean, Calvin talks about becoming, you know, I mean, finding his Japanese roots. I did too. I was very Europeanized because I grew up in Chicago, And the war was still on when my mother and I were released from camp, still 1945. And so I met lots of Europeans. And my piano teacher was the conductor of the Vienna State Opera. You know, he was a Jewish refugee. And I met many people with numbers on their arms. So my first hero was Anne Frank when I read The Diary of Anne Frank, because I never saw an image of myself, you know, unless it was in a movie and somebody was the laundryman or some kind of, you know, an invisible role. So my one regret, as I said, was that my parents did not live to hear the apology from the United States government.
Could you talk about the myth of the model minority in the perpetual foreigner conflict that the Japanese live with?
Would you repeat that?
The myth of the model minority.
Oh, the myth
Versus
of
the
minority?
perpetual foreigner.
Well, I think, yeah, let me turn this over to
Well, the myth is that, you know, the Japanese are like, unlike other immigrant groups, very successful. And that was true economically, but there's kind of two sides of the coin. He's also referring to perpetual stranger, you know, because really if you're a full-blooded Japanese, you have the eyes, you know, people like, the question, and I grew up with this question too, where are you from? Implying that you could not be from here. You know, so that's the perpetual foreigner piece. And the myth of the model minority, I think Chinese and Japanese were kind of subject to that. And I didn't learn kind of, oh, you know, the other stereotype is, you know, Asians are really good at math.
Yeah.
Which, okay, some are, you know, but so are lots of other people. But the model minority, if you look at like a family restaurant where everybody in the family, all the kids, you know, the brothers and sisters and the aunts and uncles are working in one business. If you break down the family wage, the individual wage, you know, people are earning peanuts, but it makes the family look like they have a good income. So there's that kind of thing, yes. Did you have a comment or question?
I still have a comment on the model minority.
Okay, very good. Help me out.
Yes.
What's your name?
My name is Deli Alcantara, and I'm from the Filipino American.
Oh, yay! Okay.
I actually have a comment on the model minority. It started in 1963 from a Newsweek article.
Right.
When they were this war on poverty and the start of the welfare reform or introduction of welfare, it was really to pit the Asian community against the black community. So the model minority phrase was coined to exalt the Asian community who picked themselves up by their bootstrap to actually demean the black community as being on welfare. So that's how it started. And because nobody really knows that history, a lot of the Asians sort of embrace that with pride, but if you really know the history, it's really based on racism. And so, you know, and when they also say model minority as an Asian and a Filipino, I really kind of recoiled because like there are other Asians who are not economically well off and it's taken against us. Like when I started the Asian Family Center, they said, why are you having this Asian Family Center when all the Asians are really well off? They're not a marginalized community. But new immigrants, you know, still really need help. And just to put a plug on why the Asian Family Center was started, and Rod was on the initial board, he was one of the charter board of directors. We have a lot of Asian refugees, and that continue to this day. And how can you not be marginalized when you don't know the system and you don't speak the language? And so the Asian Family Center was established for that, and also to dispel these model minority myths.
Thank you so much. That was very educational, and that reminds me of, like, the largest Asian group in this community is Vietnamese, I believe. And, you know, of course, they're refugees from a war that went on for 20 years in their homeland. So, and where I used to live in Minnesota, it was the Hmong, who were an ethnic group from Laos, and they were part of United States CIA secret war. And that's why there are so many of them in St. Paul and Minneapolis. Yes?
I just wondered if, Nikki, you could say more about this very incredible title you have up on the board.
Of this?
Yes, the performance.
Well,
To be.
okay, now, you know that Tom Brokaw has coined that term, the greatest generation. And these are the people who grew up or were born sometime during the Depression, their 30s, and then matured during World War II, served in World War II, or protested World War II. And the little-known stories of the Japanese Americans is as was mentioned in the script, the 442nd was the most highly decorated and a unit in military history with the highest casualty rates. They rescued the Texas Battalion, the battalion that was trapped behind enemy lines in Germany, and several other U.S. Army units tried to rescue them for days and days. And the 442nd went in there, lost 2/3 of their men. You know, and one of the statements, I mean, the script that you saw today is largely made up of oral histories. I mean, the authentic voices of people that I have either interviewed or researched. So the one man said, we wanted to prove our loyalty, but we did it in blood. So 18 and 19-year-old boys, at first, like Ben, who weren't able to enlist right after the war started because we don't want Japs. Then eventually, when there was a shortage of manpower in the Army, the United States government created the 442nd and the 100th Battalion. Many of those men came from Hawaii, and those are also a lot of stories that people don't know. Also, New Mexicans don't know that there were 2 Department of Justice, more than 2, but 2 main Department of Justice camps in New Mexico, in Lordsburg and Santa Fe. And I mentioned in the little vignette on my piece that, you know, the FBI took my dad away in handcuffs. And I remember as a child, in a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old, sitting on the barracks steps in my camp in Minidoka, Idaho, in the Idaho desert. I would be opening these little packages I would get from my father's canteen in Santa Fe, stamped enemy alien mail. But when I opened them, there was Pueblo pottery and beaded moccasins and little jewelry and little wooden dolls. And I always thought that Santa Fe was a magical place. So here I am, 75 years later, and you know, it's full circle. And I think any of us who gets to do this full circle storytelling is very fortunate. I also want to tell you that I'm an oral historian. I do readers' theater because I have a theater background, but if any of you want to contact me, my card is on the table there, for oral history sharing. I'm also starting a reading group. I have many scripts like this, lots of scripts on women's peace shows, that I've done, you know, all over the country. But I really want to do this in a grassroots way, not a professional way that I've been doing for many years, when there were, you know, the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities was thriving. But I would like to bring these stories to the people of New Mexico, as well as have the people of New Mexico share their stories with me. And so I would like to work with people on, if they want to create something like this, it's fairly easy. I mean, the actual performance part is arduous, but the writing, anybody can write any kind of story. You get a bunch of people together, you know, we're always talking, we're always conversing with these stories. You write them down, you figure out who can read, you edit it. It's really a lot of fun. So we're starting a blog, and we have a newsletter that Esther edits. So we'll be, you know, making announcements like that. So if any of you are interested, or are interested in Readers Theater, volunteering, or becoming a reader, or anything like that, we'd love to hear from you.
Yes, Delia. Okay.
I think she's raising her hand forever.
Okay.
So,
Oh. Yeah.
Well, I've kind of learned to be patient because I come from folks in Mexico and everything moves a lot slower there. On that note, that's where I met Nikki, a project that's related to this. In February, when that order was issued, a month prior to that in Clovis, New Mexico, loyal citizens and railroad employees with their 17 children, 3 different families, they didn't get 2 days, they didn't get the 48 hours. They came in the middle of the night, shot their dog, destroyed their radio, and took them. And here I am all these years later, finding my purpose because Nikki's encouraged me, and I want to thank her for that. I'm not Japanese that I know of. Of course, I don't look like my brother and sister because I'm Indian, and they were the first POWs that I was aware of. That story brought me to this story, and the story just keeps evolving. And what the story, they said, is it's not just a Japanese story, it's an American story. I was raised a railroader's daughter my whole life in Clovis. This was never taught in the school. My father did not know his supervisor was a Bataan Death March survivor. Clovis was full of people that had lost people in Bataan. They shared the same anniversary as the Japanese American POWs. In fact, one family in particular that we're researching, the sister lost a brother as a POW in Bataan, while her very best friend, Lily Kimura, was taken away. So she lost 2 people to 2 different POW camps. So what I would like to say, and I'll make this brief, is that it's up to you to pass oral history. It's up to you to educate yourselves. If I could sit at a dinner table with my father every night and not know this story until 6 years ago, it's up to you to pass it to your children, your grandchildren, people that you don't even know. If you start to talk about this, they want to know more, just like you did. So thank you, Nikki, from the bottom of my heart for making me, I guess, live in World War II. I will forever be grateful to you and the rest of you that presented this. Thank you.
Victor Yamada has had a project called Chloe, which he'll tell you briefly about because it's been made into a book, and he'll tell you very briefly.
I'm off stage and all these people are on stage, so I'm not as experienced. One thing I want to add to what Nikki was saying to answer your question, the middle one, protesters, she's going to be addressing 3 of the very significant protesters during World War II and afterwards, Minya Sui, Gordon Hirabashi, and Fred Korematsu. Those were 3 very brave Japanese Americans who fought, the activities in World War II in the U.S. government. And Nikki's play will touch on that. Is that right?
And it was Gordon Hirabayashi who said, this is not a Japanese story. It's It's an American story. And I promise you'll hear that line in our next show. Because it features the 3 young men in separate cases, but it's extraordinary that one in Washington State, who was a Quaker, Gordon, another in Hood River, Oregon, who was a lawyer, and a third one in California, who just wanted to stay with his girlfriend and didn't want to go to camp. They made themselves test cases to test the Constitution. And they went to jail because they were so convinced that the Supreme Court would uphold their cases, but they were wrong. So they went to jail, but many, many years later, they received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Obama. So those are the stories that you'll see next time.
Yeah, let me briefly mention a couple of the other projects that the New Mexico JCL has been involved in. And as you can tell, these are all complementary to telling the larger story about Japanese Americans and their chapter in U.S. history and New Mexico history. As someone mentioned, we just finished phase 2 of a project called Confinement in the Land of Enchantment, Japanese Americans in New Mexico during World War II. And this phase 2 resulted in 3 products. One is this publication. 2 is, as someone asked, putting additional historic markers at Lordsburg, Fort Stanton, and Old Baton Ranch. And the third is to set up a project website that anybody can go online and look at our research materials. So this book is for sale. Back here, you can contact me after this Q&A. We first distributed this free to all of the schools in New Mexico, because obviously we want to reach the educational community, and then to historical institutions and to museums. But now we're offering this for extra folks who are interested for $15, and that's really just the printing cost. This overall project was funded by the National Park Service, so we're not selling this for a profit, we're selling it only at cost. And then phase 3 of this project, we have been funded by the National Park Service, and what we'll be doing in phase 3 is that we'll be taking this content and other material, putting together a traveling exhibit and a community presentation in 3 or near 3 of the sites, Fort Stanton, Lordsburg, and Santa Fe. And we'll have those in the fall of next year, 2018. So we'll be providing information on that. And to tie to what you were talking about, this story does cover the 4 sites in New Mexico. Clovis, as she mentioned, and the removal of those Japanese Americans to Old Baton Ranch, Lordsburg, Santa Fe, and Fort Stanton. All 4 of those are addressed in this project and this publication. The last thing I'll briefly mention, which is just relatively new news, is that we, along with the Japanese American Historical Society that's based in San Francisco, will be giving teacher training workshops in 2 locations in New Mexico. And this is just the draft flyer. I don't have extra copies yet, but it's basically going to be telling the story of the Department of Justice camps that were instituted by the federal government during World War II. And as you've heard before, to repeat, Lordsburg, Santa Fe, and Fort Stanton were 3 of those DOJ camps, and 3 happen to be in New Mexico. So we're having this teacher training workshop in February, 1 in Albuquerque and 1 in Las Cruces. And my last comment on this is that if any of you are teachers or have family who are teachers or who know people, please let them know, and we'll get this out, so that we want people that are in the teaching education, the teaching profession, to get this so that they can include this in their curriculum in their schools. Because again, I think all of you agree that one of the ways this story needs to be told and gotten to are the younger folks that are growing up in New Mexico and the rest of the U.S. That's my couple of announcements.
Just one last thing. We've been talking about World War II and everything. we have among us an author, a published author, Cynthia Grady. I have a newsletter up there, our latest one, but I guess someone took it. But she has a book coming out in January, and it's called Write to Me. Do you want to say a few words?
Is this right?
Yeah.
I've just written a book called Write to Me, Letters from Japanese American Children to the Librarian They Left Behind. And it's a picture book. It has a very long subtitle. It's basically a very gentle introduction to the incarceration of Japanese Americans, but it's also what we call a picture book biography of a woman named Clara Breed, who was a librarian in San Diego in the 1940s. And most of her patrons, she was in the downtown branch, most of the patrons were Japanese Americans. And they, so when all of the children, along with their families, were sent to the prison camps, she wrote them letters and sent them library books every week for the 3.5 years that they were imprisoned. And the children wrote back. And the Japanese American National Museum has the letters that the children wrote. And there are more than 250 of them. And they basically, without even knowing it, they were documenting their experience based on answering questions that Clara Breed asked them in her letters, like questions about the food shortage, questions about their living conditions, and they documented all of it in the letters they wrote back to her, and they basically form the spine of the story. And it comes out January 9th, and I'll be doing a talk about it at Bookworks on Saturday, January 20th. So.
Okay, yeah. One last comment.
Oh, one last comment.
Yes.
Maybe the next grant that Nikki should write to the Humanities Council is about the story of Lordsburg. I keep hearing Lordsburg, and I didn't know that there was an what do you call it? Internment camp at Lordsburg, because prior to the internment camp, Lordsburg was the place to come and get married during the period of the anti-miscegenation law. So for those of you who didn't know what that was, Orientals could not get married to white women, or there was no interracial marriage. But Lordsburg, New Mexico was the place to come to get married if you were marrying a non-Asian spouse. So I think, that's a common story for all Asians. So, and I have actually a marriage certificate of a couple who came to get married in Lordsburg. And one last thing, I forgot, Ikuku Bigay was actually also on the charter board of the Asian Family Center. She was our first treasurer. Sorry, Ikuku, it's like, I look at you and you look younger than 10 years ago. So, thank you very much. So, Nikki, Lordsburg.
Okay. Thank you all so much for coming.